All right. Hi, everyone. There's going to be some coding. So the code is available on GitHub. I just put a bit.ly link so I can see that you actually went there. So I'm counting. Yeah, so that's going to be at the end of the presentation, so you can see later on if it's worth going to. All right, so today we're going to talk about developing in JavaScript without frameworks. And the story behind that is pretty simple. You know, frameworks are huge. We've all been stuck at, like, if you did Angular, you've been stuck for 10 minutes on 96% uglify.js minifying. And it's fine, you know, frameworks gave us a lot of advantages, but the most scary thing about them is probably the fact that we're loading hundreds of packages and we rely on them without actually knowing what's going on. And without using actually, you know, Angular, React, Vue, we wouldn't have front-end development where we have it today. You know, front-end wouldn't be real programming that it's considered today. You know, a few years ago, like when you said you do web front-end, it was like, okay, so you do HTML, yeah, that's not real programming. But now, you know, backend guys see job offers for JavaScript developers, and they're like, damn. Yeah, so, and that's because of frameworks. They gave us tools that let us do things that we do today, and I would say pretty cool things. So, but frameworks gave us a lot. The platform evolved, JavaScript changed, there are a lot of new features. So let's see what we have there. And in this talk, I'm going to explore developing without any framework, without any library, with routing, with some reactivity, but also with some, you know, with some sense, which is, I'm not going to say frameworks are bad, I'm just going to give you a way. And that's based on a real project I did for a client, so it's battle tested. And the other thing is that maybe even if you're not going to use it, there's going to be some web components that you can use in a real Angular, Vue, React project. Also, it will give you an idea of how things work in frameworks. So, yeah, that was why. It's good to start with why. Where I come from, I'm a software engineer at the company called Ardigen. We do some biotechnology, genomics data analysis, and basically we help people find cures for cancerous diseases. So yeah, we code against cancer, so if you want to know more about that, just catch me after the presentation. You know, scientific data needs good front ends. They really do, because they've been in like dark ages for years. So in this talk, I'm going to mainly show practical examples. So there's going to be a little bit of reasoning at the beginning, but then we're going to do live coding, and then I'm going to mention some useful features. And actually later on today, actually at the end of the the day, we have the talk about web components. And I think I'm not going to go as deep into web components themselves, but to a structure and to approach. I'm going to focus at the structure and the approach to developing an app, but I think the talk later on will you know, focus on extending that knowledge. So if there are some holes in this talk, I think you can go to the one later and fill those in. Okay, so with frameworks, I want to say about what's good about them, because that's the things we should follow and require from approach that doesn't use a framework. At the top, I put component-based approach because everything actually starts from there. You know, just like a few years ago, we were using jQuery, but you know, it's fine. But we were using 2,000 line long files, 3,000 line long files. I'm still getting some legacy projects sometimes where, you know, we just have a few lines where there are like thousands lines of code, and we didn't really have a good way to bundle and package the code. Back then, I was there. You were trying, but there was HTTP1 and actually loading a lot of files. Everyone was saying like, do not load 50 files in one web page, right? So we tried to avoid it. Bundling was hard, And then there came bundling tools, there came frameworks, and we got component-based approach, which actually is a pretty simple idea, but let us split everything into nice chunks, reuse the code, and was a game changer. And from component-based approach, there came structure. Structure in projects where you work with other people is obviously important. From structure, there came standards. And with standards, we came to a point where we do not need project veterans. If someone knows Angular, this person goes to the project and they know Angular. If someone knows React, well, React projects are more variable, but you actually, when you go to a project, you know what's going on. So that was great. And actually, there came modules, NPM, and right now, we do not really have to reinvent the wheel, right? It's the point where like there's package for everything. It's not not always a good package, but there are ways to make things really fast. And actually, for prototyping and rapid development, there is everything out there. And the other thing is support, right? But support is tricky, as we saw with Angular.js, with Angular 1. But you know, Angular is supported by Google, Facebook supports React, and Vue actually is supported by one guy from China, but he has a great team, and it seems to work so far. But the thing that actually, because we started using frameworks, was data binding, right? I remember this first example in Angular.js. It was like, you know, you type in some texts and everything updates on the page. It was like magic. It was like, yay, that's the way to go. And that let us imagine frontends that we create today. But there came bad stuff. I'm not going to focus on bad stuff that much because I don't want to be biased. But you know, those sites are heavy. It happens to me, like I have a flagship smartphone, but when I go to some, you know, not that popular page, it sometimes, or an app, it sometimes happens that, you know, things are very slow. You wait 3 seconds until like a pop-up loads. And it's not a fault of frameworks, but apparently not everyone is ready to use them. Things load slowly, and in Poland it's not a problem. Because we have fast internet, we have good phones, we have good computers, but especially when you develop for like Asia or for like anywhere where the internet speeds are slow, even US, like rural areas, these guys like have really slow connections. So when you think about it and when you start testing, it turns out that, you know, your website is just slow. You can do server-side rendering, that helps. You can do a lot of stuff, but maybe for simple projects, we don't have to do it. And the size is not such of a problem with your gzip stuff, but later processing this JavaScript code is a problem, especially on mobile, where like CPUs are there. We've got like 8 cores, but we still have got like the same batteries for a few years, so that's a problem. Frameworks also get outdated. They change and update. Change and update is good, outdated is not. There's support, but many of us were left out where Angular.js was abandoned. I think support ends like somewhere next year or this year. And what can we do? Some of us have to stay in legacy projects, do them, and it's not nice. And it wouldn't be great to repeat this thing. So maybe let's see what alternatives are there. At my company, we also use multiple frameworks, like actually 2 now, like Vue and Angular, and there's actually no way to reuse the code, especially between TypeScript and JavaScript. You can copy TypeScript and remove types, which, yeah, or just transpile it to ES5, but that's a lot of hassle when you just need, you know, one component. So that's not really a good way to go. You are faster just writing it. It's faster to just write it yourself. So let's think about that. And also, you just know one framework, right? Frameworks and some new frameworks emerge, but we are left here working years and years, and it's not nice to find out like one day that, hey, I cannot find any new project with the framework I know, and I have to learn, become a master of another one in a month. So, you know, and it's not everyone wants to spend hours after work and learn new stuff every time. So JavaScript changed, as I said, and I think it's time to consider not using a framework in some cases. But the thing is, are we ready to use them? We did some pretty bad stuff with frameworks, with slow websites. So if we like are left out ourselves without structure, without guidelines, we can do pretty bad stuff in JavaScript as well, as we did in JavaScript days. So let's just take it easy, right? And that's actually a warning for, like, if you're a big company and you have like 20 front-end developers, maybe going vanilla JS now is not such a great idea, because people are going to do whatever they want. So web components actually let us do a lot of this stuff. So they take care of the component part and splitting code in parts. I'm going to show an example in a second. Routing is simple, as you'll see. Basic router is 20 lines of code. Another 20 lines of code is parameter parsing, and some more fancy features is another 20 lines of code. But if you want to use like a production-ready router, I encourage you to use a library. I'm just going to use a dictionary with routes today. Data binding, this is the trickiest part. There is no good answer for that without using libraries. You have to write events like in good old days. But from my experience, when I had to create a fast Angular apps, we actually turned off change watching and actually told Angular exactly what to watch. Because we had so many variables that watching for changes was just too slow, and there's this huge loop running all the time in the system. And the funny thing is that actually watching for changes in Angular is limited to like 5 levels deep. So if you ever like nest 15 levels deep, so if you like nest 15 components in each other, which is possible, I think this thing just starts to break apart, because they just cut the tree at one point. And there are libraries. I'm not going to use libraries because we're looking at the vanilla JS stuff, but there's like lit HTML for elements. I'm going to give you a link later on. But a library is not a framework. It doesn't define your life. Library, you can switch it with another one, or yours. And so we'll just use Webpack dev server, and just for compatibility, we'll use Babel for converting new JavaScript to the old one. But actually, you don't have to use those if you want to support 90% of browsers, because actually JavaScript modules work now. Okay, so let's actually do some coding. I'm not going to just blindly show off and write everything down. So I'm going to copy some code in, but we're going to see most of the stuff. So I'm going to create a new folder. Okay. A new folder. And right now, let's see how we start a project without actually, having a CLI that was done for us. So what we do, can you see that? Okay, it's small. Can you see the text? All right, thanks. So let's do npm init, and let's do flag y, so we don't have to say anything. Basically, what we are getting is a JSON file with definition of our project. So these following 5 minutes, we're just doing what like ng init does, or view start, or create React app does. But that's the thing you do once. So okay, and for installing dependencies, we're going to need Webpack, as I said. There's a README in the repository, so I'm going to use the commands from there, not to type them in. So let's actually use Webpack. And I don't have Wi-Fi. Okay, what is the password? Does someone know? There was something. Actually, I have those cached, so that should be fine, but okay, never mind. If we have problems, we'll do that. Okay, we have Webpack. So right now, let's create actually some code. So what we're going to need is we're going to need a folder called src. These are just Webpack defaults, so you don't have to do configuration. And we're going to do index.js. So let's test what we have. Let's go to package.json and actually define a task for build. And for build, it's just Webpack. So let's run npm run build. Okay, we have warning that we do not specify whether it's production or development, but that's fine. We have the dist folder, and there's a main.js file that contains what we compiled in index.js. So that's a basic scaffolding you need for transpiling, for using classes in Internet Explorer and all the goodies. So let's actually go and do some more stuff. So I'm going to install HTML loader. So the purpose of this is that we can have index.html file in our main src catalog, and that it gets copied to src. And the last thing we'll need is actually to have Webpack dev server for live reloading and watching for changes, so we don't have to refresh our browser and console. And the last thing is Babel for transpilation. Webpack config, well, yeah, there are Webpack configs. These things are not pretty, but we're not going to use a complicated one. We have to create webpack config.js in our main Katowice directory. And what I'm going to paste in is just a definition. So for a definition, let me tell you what we're doing here. We're taking JavaScript files and telling the Babel loader to transpile them to ES5. And the next step is that we're taking HTML files and that we're passing them through HTML loader and minimizing them on the way. That's like the basic setup you could use. And the last thing is we're copying index.html to index.html so we can have it in final directory, and this way we end up with two files, index.html and main.js. And the good thing about it is that we don't have to include main.js in index.html. These plugins take care of that. So let's create a basic HTML structure. I'm using Visual Studio Code, and there's this emmet plugin. When you create, it just has snippets that allow you to rapidly develop. So I'm going to, just for a test, I'm going to write h1. Okay, h1, and let's do something. Okay. And right now, let's see if that works. So we're going to do npm run, npm start. Not this framework. Okay. We don't have the start script, so we have to actually add it to package.json. So start, and we need webpack dev server. And actually, to redirect or request to our index.html file, because we'll have routing, we need one more thing that actually is taken care of on the server later on, which is redirect all the routes to our one index.html file. The command is actually history API fallback. So we're going to use this history API fallback flag, and that will allow us to avoid 404s when we go to another route. So let's do npm start. Actually, we have it's somewhere said that the 404s will be redirected. Okay, never mind. Let's see if that works. Okay, we have 8080. The demo works, but that's just plain JavaScript. So let's actually start adding some components. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a file, app.component.js. I'm going to say component.js like in Angular, but you can do whatever you want. So the first thing is, how do we handle templates? I'm going to take the simplest approach, which is to write them to a variable and to template literal with some formatting that comes from a plugin. But actually, you can have them in separate HTML files. But that's just another few lines of code for loading those from HTML files. But if you have small components, you can keep them there. If you wrote in React, you actually are used to it. I don't write in React, and I think that mixing HTML with JavaScript is not a good idea, but I think that a lot of people will argue with me. So, so I'm going to create a template variable, and I have this one plugin. The name is in the slides at the end. It actually allows me to highlight the string, template literals with HTML inside it. So I'm going to actually do an h1 again and do hello too. We'll replace this one later on. Oh yeah, let's actually remove it and tell ourselves that our app will be in ID equals app. Okay, so we've got some template, and let's actually create our first web component. So it's done by extending an HTML element class. So we're going to do is class app extends HTML element. HTML element has two essential methods. Actually, the first one is constructor. And in constructor, you have to run this super function so it loads everything needed for it to be HTML component. Another one that you can use is connected callback. If you use another framework, it's like ng after init, or in React we have the same. In Vue there is mounted, so it's everywhere. So basic constructor is just preparing stuff, loading variables, and connected is while everything is loaded to the DOM, to the browser. So in connected, you probably should do API requests, etc. Okay, so once we have it, actually, let's do something with our template. So there's good old inner HTML, and I'm going to just say that it's template. So before actually rendering the component, it will take the template from the variable, load it into component, and then render it, and then we could operate on it in the connected callback. To actually make it work, in the end, we need to register it. So we need to do window.custom elements and register. And we need to register it by name. One thing that we have to do is to use a dash inside, so browser knows that it's a custom element. That's the rule they did. If it has dash inside, the browser will check whether that's a custom element. So I'm going to use app main and say that the class app represents that object. And the last thing I like to do actually in the components is to export the tag that can be used to use the element. So that's just for practicality. You'll see why I do it later on. Okay, we have that, but we have our empty page. Nothing happens. So let's actually initialize our app. So in index.js, I'm going to actually import our app component. So import app from app component, and another part of good old JavaScript. So we're going to document query selector, and we want to select our app container and take inner HTML and set it to app. As you saw, I have exported the string with the markup from app, so I can do this. Basically, I have exported the tag here. If we refresh, we cannot see anything, and that's because I didn't do one thing. I always mess these things up. Window, custom elements. Script? Właśnie tego nie potrzebujemy zrobić, bo patrzcie. We don't need to do it, but we don't have register. Window custom elements register. I'm going to show you why that didn't work, but it's not register, it's define, I think. It's most likely define. Yep, it's define. Okay, we have hello too. And the magic that happened that happened there, oh, it's minified. Let's actually turn off minifying and restart Webpack, so we can actually see what's going on. So actually, what Webpack does, it automatically includes the main.js file. That's the advantage of HTML loader we use. So yeah, it was there, but good point. All right, so we have our first component, right? Main component, update component. When you actually see the source, in the source, what we should, okay, we won't see it here, but if we do inspect, in the body, we actually can see, or you can't, we can see that there's app main tag. The same thing we could do without, the same thing we would achieve without assigning the app here, but just, you know, setting the string with app main. But the export is just the shortcut I like to use. Okay, we've got our first component. Let's actually do another one, so we see how the flow looks. So I'm going to use a components directory. I did a file. Great. Let's do let's do it in command line. mkdir make dir components. Actually, later on we'll do 2 pages, so I'm going to do a view folder, and we're going to work with one API. So I'm going to do services. So as you can see, my approach is kind of Angular view mixed. But you know, you can do whatever you want here. All right. So we've got the folder. So let's go into components, and I'm going to touch some header component. We're going to have the menu there later on. Okay. Of course I messed up because I wanted to have that in src. That's fine. Right, we've got our component. So here goes the same thing. Some component creation CLI would be nice here, but it's not that much of a hassle. So we're going to create a template for header. Let's just do something simple. I'm going to use div with a class .nav. And with styling, actually, what is usually recommended is to embed it like this. It's easily parsed by the browser, and that's a recommended standard. So I'm going to use nav and say that it should have width of 100% and say border bottom 1px solid DD. All right, and let's actually put some small tag in here. 4Developers. All right. We have the component, so let's actually give it a proper name. Header. Okay, so now how do we nest these components? Let's go to app component. And we can import our newly created components. So we import header from components, header component. And there are actually 2 ways as before. So one way to have the nice HTML would be to use app header, because it's already, we imported it so it's visible. But if you want to use some more dynamic approach and don't rely on name changes, you can use template literals and just render a string here. And that would work as well. So we've got our nice little header. And so that's the component nesting. Let's actually see how we would work with multiple pages. So I'm going to go to views and create home, and also create a some other page. All right, so I'm also again going to duplicate the code, and we're not going to need header. Let's just leave some h2 that it's home, and the flow is the same. So home. Okay. Let's just replace that. Okay, we've got our first component, and actually now let's create another component. So that's just to visualize what how the routing could look like. As you can see, probably if you're at the point where you have to find and replace stuff, that's a good point to automate things. I want to stay vanilla here, but there are like, you know, Puppet or other scripts that let you generate those. But you know, that's just a simple class. Okay, we've got two pages. We've got home and other. So how do we actually route to those? The next thing I'm going to do is, while I'm in src folder, I'm going to create router.js and create some simple routing. So with routing, and the first thing we need is routes themselves. So yes, see out. Well, that was a long time ago. Really. I guess habits, right? Okay, so main route would be home okay. Updates. Okay, we can do it this way. With default exports, we don't have to name it in the same way. And the other would be, let's see, yes, okay, auto imports, I love it. Okay, and then we have we need an init function, so we make everything work. So the way the router can work is very simple. There's no validation, of course, but what we can do is we can get some root element and set its inner HTML to one of our components. So we would do routes, and then we need location. So it's window location path name, and that should actually work. So let's go to app component and actually initialize it. So I'm going to import router from router, and in connected callback, after everything is initialized, I'm going to do router.init, but one thing I forgot, which is to actually export something. So I'm going to export default an object with routes, just so we have them, and init function. So with that, router init should be accessible here, and the next thing we need is actually an element to render routes to. So let's actually define some outlet. I'm going to do ID. ID router outlet. It could be, you know, an attribute, but let's stay simple here. Okay, so root element is going to be this. This in actually in HTML element classes, this is very straightforward. This is always the element we're modifying, and it's both the HTML element class and HTML element itself. So you always modify it by using this. So with query selector, we're going to select router outlet. Okay, and let's pass it to our router, and let's see what happens. Okay, we are at the route and we get home. Let's try other, and other is presented. It's of course reloading here between navigations, but that's just basic routing, right? well, we do not need heavy routing here. But to make it any complete and a single page app, I'm going to actually add history and links. So that would be lengthy to type that in. So let's just quickly get it and explain it. Okay, we've got our init function. Let's see what's going on here. Okay. All right. And so yeah, first part is handling links. So with links, what approach I used is we're going to add a router link attribute to any element. For example, it's going to look like this, right? So we're selecting all elements that has this attribute, binary one. And for each of them, we're going to add event listener for clicks, prevent default navigation, then get desired location from href attribute, and then basically just do the same thing we did above, which is to assign a proper element to our root element. And the last thing is to actually make browser notice that we navigated, so to update the browser history. And the last event is onPopState, which onPopState is basically when you go back. So when we go back, we want to go to a previous component. So when I save it, we need actually a link to navigate to. So we're going to go to our header component.js and add some links. So let's do href, main path, okay, and that's going to be home, and another. Okay, and when I go through them, does it refresh? It does refresh for some reason. Okay, we need router link that I missed. Okay. All right. And now if we click, we have no refresh navigation. If we go back, we just go back, and that's routing. Of course, the thing missing here is parsing parameters, but that's just as simple as that. You can do it in different ways. For example, people do it, for example, specifying them like that, and you can easily get them out. Or just splitting the paths by slashes. There are multiple ways to do it. Okay, so there's navigation. We have almost everything. How much time? We have 7 minutes. So 7 minutes is great, actually, to do some API fetching. I think that's a great idea. But if I can do it in 7 minutes, then maybe I will convince you to use vanilla.js. So let's actually do it. I'm going to get the code that I have prepared. So we're going to look at that. API.js. My copy and paste skills are not good today. Okay, so the code is really simple. We're going to use a service called JSON placeholder. It just provides us like ready-to-use JSON structures to parse on our websites, and we're going to use built-in fetch API to get something from the API. So basically, we're getting the response, we're awaiting it, we're using async await, and then we're getting JSON from the response and returning posts, and that's all built in. No Axios here. And to do it, we're going to go to our home component and import our service from, we need to go up, not components, services, API.js. Okay, and in connected callback, this is where we should do those actions. We're going to actually make it async. And we're going to get posts, and we're going to await API.get. And the next thing is to actually prepare the HTML, and that's where things get not that nice here, but they're still bearable. So posts HTML, I'm going to do map, and I'm going to map each post to HTML markup we want to use. You can use some custom element here. I'm going to use a simple div for a post, and let's actually format it. This is just ES6 string HTML formatter. That's the plugin name. Okay, and let's use h3, and use template literal to do post.title, and let's do p to do post.body. And I'm actually going to separate them by a line. I don't need that. Okay, so we've got some post rendering, and let's make actually one string from that. So I'm going to join it by the new line sign. And now what we can do is just basically render it. So rendering is just passing it to this.inner HTML. And to do it, I'm just going to append it to our heading. So post HTML. One thing is that the post should be here. Of course, something is wrong, but let's see the console. Internet disconnected. Okay, no problem. Let's just give us a second. Yeah, but we actually did it in 2 minutes, so we have time for this. Okay. I've got Wi-Fi. All right. Let's refresh. And the post loaded. Yay. We've got API integration. So with that, I think you should pay attention to web components. There's a talk later on that I hope will give you an idea of how to do reactivity and some live updating. Just a heads up, you're going to use events if you're not going to use libraries. So basically, in those HTML elements, the only way to actually react to changes is to use events. There's another function called getObservedAttributes, which actually is run every time an HTML element attribute changes. And attribute, I mean something like this. So we can watch for changes on those attributes, but to watch, for example, someone's input from text field, you have to write an event on input. So reactivity is not yet in like mainline JavaScript, but there are plans to add it. But I think this gives us plenty of options. So coming back to the presentation, the things I want you guys to remember is that JavaScript is at the point where you can create scalable JavaScript apps. The routing is, I thought that routing is complicated once, but then I tried to write router myself. It's pretty nice. Web components are in, so you can structure your code in a really nice way. The great way is that web components can be used in any framework. So even if you think that, okay, this is nice, this is simple, but I've got a big project, we can't rewrite it, that's of course something you shouldn't do if you have a working project. You shouldn't rewrite it, but you can use, those new bits to be ready for the future and to have reusable component libraries. And web components can be used in every major framework. So why not actually create some code that you can reuse and maybe use in the future to future-proof your project? These are those main two things. So if you like the talk, please rate it on inventory. That will give organizers an idea that this is something you want to listen. And if you have any feedback, please leave it to me so I can make the talk better. So the resources, they're available on GitHub. If you want to learn more about web components themselves and what HTML and JavaScript are now. And these links are also here. There's a PDF of the presentation on GitHub. Via binary files on GitHub, I know, but yeah. So if you have any questions, please, I'm here for 15 minutes more, and thank you for your attention.
you.